In 1868, a construction crew working for the Union Pacific Railroad reached the edge of Dale Creek in southeastern Wyoming, looked down, and stopped walking. The ravine below them dropped 126 feet straight into granite. It was 600 feet across. And on the other side of it, the Transcontinental Railroad was supposed to keep going west. They had no steel mill within 1,000 miles. They had no concrete. What they had was timber from the Black Hills, iron bolts, hand tools, and about 4 months before the deadline. So they built a wooden bridge across it, 600 feet long, 126 feet high, held together with lumber and iron rods, swaying so badly in the Wyoming wind that they had to anchor it with guy ropes staked into the rock on both sides. 2 carpenters fell from the deck during construction and died on the canyon floor below. The bridge opened anyway. Trains crossed it at 5 miles per hour, while passengers gripped their armrests and stared out the windows at nothing but air and the creek bed far beneath them. That bridge no longer exists. It was replaced with iron within a decade because the wood was already rotting. But for those first years, the only thing connecting the eastern and western halves of America's first transcontinental railroad was a wall of stacked timber stretching across empty space. And the men who built it had no safety harnesses, no hard hats, no nets beneath them. They worked in leather boots on wet timber 100 feet up, and they trusted their footing and each other, because that was all they had. I have spent months going through the construction records, the engineering journals, and the accident reports from this era. What I've found is a story that most people have never heard. Between the 1850s and the early 1900s, American railroad crews built thousands of wooden bridges across canyons, gorges, and river valleys that would terrify a modern structural engineer. Some of these trestles stood over 200 feet tall. Some stretched more than half a mile long. And all of them were built by hand, by men whose names rarely made it into any history book. This is how they did it. And this is what it cost. To understand why anyone would attempt to cross a 300-foot canyon with wood, you need to understand one thing about steam locomotives. They cannot climb. A horse can walk up a 15% grade without much trouble. A modern truck can handle 6 or 7%. But a steam engine pulling freight in the 1880s could barely manage 2%, and anything steeper than 4% was considered nearly impossible. That meant every hill, every valley, every canyon was a crisis. You could not just go around. Going around a deep canyon might add 8 miles of track, and 8 miles of track in rough terrain could cost $250,000 in 1880s money, which is close to $8 million today. It would also add hours to every trip, burning coal and wages the entire way. So the railroads needed to go straight through mountains, which meant tunnels, and straight across canyons, which meant bridges. The problem was that in most of the American West, there was no steel within reach. The nearest rolling mills were in Pennsylvania and Ohio, 1,000 miles or more from the construction sites in Wyoming, Montana, Oregon, and California. But there was wood. Forests of Douglas fir and pine and redwood stood within hauling distance of nearly every construction site west of the Mississippi. Timber was cheap, it was local, and you could shape it with hand tools on site. And in 1840, a Massachusetts millwright named William Howe had invented something that made timber bridges practical for railroads: the Howe Truss. You need to know what this is because it is the skeleton inside almost every great wooden railroad bridge built in the 19th century. Picture a rectangular frame lying on its side. Now add diagonal beams that slope inward toward the center, forming a series of triangles. The diagonals are wood, thick timbers cut from old-growth trees. The vertical members connecting the top and bottom of the frame are iron rods with threaded ends. Those iron rods are what made the Howe truss brilliant. As the wood aged, as it shrank and warped and loosened at the joints, a maintenance crew could tighten the iron rods with a wrench and pull the whole structure back into compression. The bridge could be tuned like an instrument. It was self-correcting. Before Howe, wooden bridges failed at their joints. The mortise and tenon connections that held the timbers together would loosen under the vibration of passing trains, and once they loosened, the bridge began to flex. And once it began to flex, it was only a matter of time. Howe eliminated the weakest link. His iron rods handled the tension. His wooden diagonals handled the compression. And because wood is naturally strong in compression, the whole system worked beautifully. The Howe truss could be prefabricated. You could cut and shape every piece at a sawmill, load it on wagons, haul it to the construction site, and assemble it with an adze, an auger, and a saw. You did not need a foundry. You did not need a machine shop. You needed men who knew how to cut wood and turn a bolt. And in the 1850s and 1860s and 1870s, there were plenty of those men, because the country was full of carpenters and millwrights who had learned their trade building barns and houses and churches, and were now being offered steady wages to go west and build bridges for the railroads. The economics were straightforward. A wooden Howe truss bridge cost roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of what an iron bridge cost, and it could be built in a fraction of the time. The Kinzua Viaduct, which I will tell you about later, cost $167,000 to build from iron in 1882. A comparable wooden trestle at the same site would have cost perhaps $60,000 to $80,000, though it would have needed replacing within 2 decades. The railroads understood this trade-off perfectly. Build cheap, build fast, start earning revenue, then use the profits to rebuild in something permanent. It was a calculated gamble, and it worked. The entire Western Railroad network was essentially bootstrapped on temporary wooden bridges. The way a timber trestle gets built across a canyon is one of the most physically demanding construction processes ever devised. I want you to picture this clearly, because the photographs do not capture it. They show the finished product, a lattice of timber standing against the sky. They do not show what it took to put it there. First, you clear the site. On both rims of the canyon, crews with axes and saws cut every tree, bush, and root within 100 feet of the planned bridge abutments. The soil is stripped down to bedrock or hard clay, and the abutment foundations are laid, usually thick walls of stone or heavy timber cribbing filled with rock. This alone can take weeks. Then the bents go in. A bent is a single vertical frame, like one slice of the bridge standing upright. For a pile trestle, the simplest kind, each bent is made of 3 to 5 timber poles, pounded straight down into the ground by a pile driver. The pile driver is a steam-powered machine, or sometimes just a heavy iron weight, raised by a cable and pulley and dropped repeatedly onto the top of the pole until it is driven deep enough to hold. The sound of the pile driver carries for miles across the canyon. It is a rhythmic, concussive thud that shakes the ground, and it goes on from dawn until dark. For taller trestles, the ones that needed to stand 100, 150, 200 feet above the canyon floor, pile driving was not enough. These required framed bents, built from squared timbers set on stone foundations or heavy mud sills. The carpenters assembled each bent flat on the ground, then raised it into position using ropes, block and tackle, and raw muscle. On the tallest structures, they used a device called a gin pole, which was essentially a single tall mast with a pulley at the top. You anchored the gin pole to the first completed bent, then used it to hoist materials and frame members for the next bent. Once the second bent was standing and braced, you moved the gin pole forward and did it again, and again, and again, until you reached the other side. The bents were spaced 12 to 16 feet apart. Each one had to be plumb, level, and braced before the next could begin. On a 2,000-foot bridge, that meant over 130 individual bents, each one assembled and raised by hand. The cap timbers went across the top of each bent, and then the stringers, the long horizontal beams that carried the actual railroad track, were laid from cap to cap. Railroad ties were set on top of the stringers about 12 inches apart, and the iron rails were spiked into the ties. That is the simple version. The reality was brutal. Consider the men. On most Western railroad construction projects in the 1880s and 1890s, the bridge crews were drawn from the same labor pool that built everything else. Irish immigrants who had come west looking for work after the famine years and the Civil War. Italian laborers recruited straight off the boats in New York and shipped by rail to construction camps in Montana and Wyoming. Mexican workers who crossed the border into Texas and New Mexico and Arizona. Chinese laborers, tens of thousands of them, who had built the Central Pacific through the Sierra Nevada and were now scattered across the West looking for the next job. And native-born Americans, men from Appalachia and the Midwest, farm boys and mill workers and veterans, all of them young. The average age on a bridge construction crew was somewhere around 24. They were paid between $1.50 and $2.25 a day, depending on skill and location. In today's money, that is roughly $45 to $70. For 10 hours of work, 6 days a week, often at elevation, often in wind, often in temperatures that ranged from over 100 degrees in summer to 20 below zero in winter. The construction camps were temporary cities of canvas tents and rough-sawn board shacks. The food was beans, salt pork, bread, and coffee. The water came from whatever creek or spring was nearest. Sanitation was minimal. Disease was constant. Dysentery, typhoid, and pneumonia moved through the camps in waves. And the injuries were relentless. A bridge crew typically numbered between 40 and 150 men, depending on the size of the project. They were organized into gangs, each with a specific function. The timber gang felled trees, bucked them into lengths, and squared the logs into beams using broad axes and adzes. An experienced man could square a 40-foot timber in about 4 hours, working in a rhythm of chips flying off the log in arcs. The smell of fresh-cut pine sap was thick enough to taste. The foundation gang dug footings, set stone piers, and built the abutments. The erection gang, the most dangerous assignment on the project, assembled the bents and raised them into position. And the bolting gang followed behind, driving the iron rods through their holes and tightening them until the structure was rigid. The foreman ran the crew with absolute authority. He decided who worked where, who got promoted, who got fired, and who got the most dangerous assignments. On most projects, the newest men and the most expendable, which often meant the most recently arrived immigrants, got sent to the highest and most exposed positions. There was no formal training. You learned by watching the man next to you, and if he fell, you learned by watching what he did wrong. Working at height on raw timber with hand tools, the ways to get hurt were endless. Men fell. That was the most common and the most fatal. A misstep on a wet stringer, a gust of wind on an unbraced bent, a rope that slipped through frozen hands. The fall itself was not always what killed them. Sometimes the canyon floor was 200 feet below, and the outcome was certain. Sometimes it was 40 feet, and the man landed on a pile of lumber or a rock ledge and broke his back or shattered his pelvis and lived for hours or days before he died. Splints and laudanum were the available medical treatment. Surgery was rare. If a man survived the fall with crushed limbs, the camp doctor, if there was one, might attempt an amputation with a bone saw and whiskey. Cable failures killed men too. The rigging systems used to lift heavy timbers into position relied on hemp ropes and iron cables, and both broke under load without warning. A snapped cable under tension whips with enough force to cut a man in half. Construction reports from the era describe it with clinical detachment. Cable parted. One man killed instantly. Another lost his right arm below the elbow. Logs rolled off carts and pinned men against other logs, crushing their chests. Pile drivers dropped their weights on men's hands and skulls. Trees being felled for bridge timber kicked back and struck the men cutting them. Every day, in every camp, someone was hurt. The death toll for the entire wooden trestle era has never been accurately counted. No one kept comprehensive records. The railroads recorded deaths when they had to, usually when a coroner or a county official was involved. In Langtree, Texas, near the Pecos River, it was Judge Roy Bean who served as coroner for the construction accidents during the building of the High Bridge there. But Bean was also the local saloon keeper and justice of the peace, and his records were not what anyone would call thorough. What we do know is that the railroads estimated an average of 1 death for every mile of track laid in the West. And bridges, because of the height and the complexity, were far more dangerous than open track. A conservative estimate puts the death rate on major bridge projects at 3 to 5 times the average. Now let me take you to a few of the specific bridges that define this era. Because the scale of what these men built is difficult to comprehend until you see it in specific terms. In northern Montana, the Great Northern Railway built a timber trestle over 2 Medicine Creek that stood 214 feet above the water. 214 feet of stacked wood. That is taller than a 20-story building. The timbers were Douglas fir, cut from the forests along the rail line and hauled to the site by mule teams. Each timber weighed hundreds of pounds. The largest members, the main posts of the tower bents, could weigh over 1,000 pounds each and had to be raised vertically into position using nothing but ropes and pulleys and the coordinated strength of a dozen men pulling in unison while a foreman shouted commands over the wind. The trestle was built on framed bents, each one assembled on the ground and raised into position by crews using block and tackle. The wind in that part of Montana is vicious. It comes down off the Rockies with nothing to slow it, and it hits the broad face of a timber trestle like a sail. The bridge had to be designed not just to carry the weight of a locomotive and train, but to resist lateral wind loads that could reach 80 miles per hour. The engineers added diagonal bracing between the bents, turning the structure into a rigid cage. But even with bracing, the trestle swayed. Locomotive engineers who crossed it reported that you could feel the entire structure move beneath you. The timber groaned, the iron bolts creaked, and 200 feet below, the creek looked like a silver thread. Passengers who rode across it for the first time often described the experience as the most terrifying 10 minutes of their lives. The speed limit on most of these high trestles was 5 miles per hour, which meant that a 2,000-foot crossing took nearly 5 full minutes of suspended terror. In the Pacific Northwest, the logging railroads built wooden trestles that are almost impossible to believe. These were not mainline railroads with corporate backing and engineering departments. These were local operations, run by lumber companies that needed to get timber out of steep mountain valleys and down to the sawmills. The bridges were built by the same men who felled the trees, rough and practical workers who knew wood the way a butcher knows meat. They could look at a standing tree and tell you whether it would make a good bridge timber or whether it had too many knots, too much twist, too much heartwood rot. They built by experience and instinct as much as by plan. The West Canyon Creek trestle on one of these logging lines was 750 feet long and 182 feet high, and it curved. The entire bridge turned nearly 90 degrees over its length, carrying the rail line around the head of the canyon in a long, graceful arc. The timbers were old-growth fir and cedar, some of them 3 feet in diameter at the base. The curvature of the track had to be calculated so precisely that the locomotive's centrifugal force would not pull it off the outside rail. These calculations were done by hand, on paper, by engineers who had no computers, no structural analysis software, Nothing but slide rules and trigonometry tables and experience. The Cedar River logging trestle in Washington state stood 203 feet high. Photographs of it show what looks like a wall of wood rising from the valley floor, impossibly thin and impossibly tall, with a train on top of it that looks like a toy. Untreated lumber lasted about 20 years before it began to decay, so these trestles were always in a race against time. Maintenance crews inspected them constantly, replacing rotted timbers, tightening bolts, shoring up foundations. And even with constant care, fire was always the worst enemy. A steam locomotive throws sparks. A wooden bridge is fuel. Fire suppression was sometimes nothing more than a water barrel and a bucket stationed at each end of the trestle, manned by a watchman whose only job was to put out fires before they spread. On hot summer days, when the timber was kiln dry from months without rain, a single spark from a locomotive's smokestack could ignite a stringer and have the entire bridge burning within minutes. Once a fire took hold in the interior bracing of a tall trestle, there was almost nothing anyone could do. The structure would burn from the inside out, the outer timbers holding their shape until the internal members failed, and then the whole thing would collapse in a cascade of fire and splintering wood. In some cases, the watchmen themselves were killed when a bridge they were patrolling caught fire faster than they could retreat. And then there is the Goat Canyon trestle, which is the one that still stands, and the one that will break your heart when you understand what it is. In the Carrizo Gorge of southeastern California, a railroad called the San Diego and Arizona Eastern had been trying to push a line through the mountains since 1907. They called it the Impossible Railroad, and the name was earned. The 11-mile stretch through Carrizo Gorge required 17 tunnels, totaling over 13,000 feet of bore through fractured rock. The total cost came to $18 million in 1919 money, which is over $300 million today, for 11 miles. In 1932, an earthquake collapsed Tunnel 15 at Goat Canyon, and the railroad had to find another way across. They chose wood. Redwood timber, specifically, because the extreme temperature swings in the desert canyon could cause metal fatigue in a steel bridge, but redwood handles thermal expansion and contraction without cracking. The Goat Canyon Trestle was completed in 1933. It is 633 feet long and 185 feet tall, and it curves on a 14-degree arc to resist the canyon's high winds. It was built without nails. Every connection is bolted. Sections were assembled at the bottom of the canyon and hoisted into position from the partially completed deck above. The construction workers took their breaks inside the collapsed tunnel they called the mud shed. It cost $319,771 to build, which is about $7.5 million in today's dollars, and it is the largest curved all-wood trestle in the world. The railroad also installed an elaborate fire suppression system on the trestle, a network of water pipes and valves connected to a large water tank on the hillside above. They even mounted a fire engine on flanged wheels and parked it at the Jacumba Depot at the southern approach to the gorge, ready to roll down the tracks at the first sign of smoke. In the oven-like heat of the Mojave Desert, with steam locomotives throwing sparks, a wooden trestle was a fire waiting to happen. The precautions were not paranoia, they were survival. The trestle still stands today, though no train has crossed it regularly since 1951. In 1976, Hurricane Kathleen tore through the gorge and damaged the trestle's footings, along with much of the rest of the line. Repairs were not completed until 1981, and the railroad closed again in 1983 due to collapsed tunnels. It has been essentially abandoned since 2008. Hikers reach it by a grueling 6-mile desert trail, climbing 1,200 feet through rocky canyons, and then descending 1,000 feet into Goat Canyon itself. And when they round the last bend and see it, this enormous lattice of redwood timber curving across the void, most of them stop and stare for a long time before they say anything. There are derailed train cars from 1984 still lying on the steep hillside below the tracks, filled with bags of cement that laborers were brought in to unload, though the cars themselves were simply left where they fell. The desert has been slowly reclaiming them for 40 years. I want you to understand the full scope of what happened during this era. By the 1890s, there were tens of thousands of wooden railroad bridges in the United States. The Canadian Pacific Railway alone had 4.5 kilometers of wooden trestle just on the approaches to its crossing of the Oldman River in Alberta, all of which had to be replaced within a decade because the wood could not handle the increasing weight of freight traffic. The original wooden trestle there was 2,933 feet long and only 66 feet high, but it required constant maintenance and was eventually replaced in 1909 by the Lethbridge Viaduct, a steel structure that stands 314 feet above the river and stretches over a mile. The transition from wood to iron and steel was inevitable, and it happened faster than most people realize. The Kinzua Viaduct in McKean County, Pennsylvania, was designed by an engineer named Octave Chanute in 1882. Chanute was a French-born American who would later become one of the most important figures in the history of aviation, corresponding with the Wright brothers and helping them develop their ideas about flight. But in 1882, he was a bridge builder, and the challenge in front of him was the Kinzua Valley, 301 feet deep and over 2,000 feet across. The railroad president, General Thomas Kane, a Civil War veteran who had been briefly held as a prisoner, needed to get his trains across the valley to reach the coal fields of Elk County. The alternative was laying 8 additional miles of track over rough terrain, which would cost time and money that Kane did not have. Chanute designed a viaduct of wrought iron, not wood, specifically because the loads were too heavy for timber. The Phoenix Bridge Company of Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, fabricated the iron towers in sections at their plant and shipped them to the site. The construction technique was ingenious. 40 men built it in 94 days, using no scaffolding. They erected the first tower using a gin pole, then built a wooden crane on top of that first tower and used it to erect the second tower. Then moved the crane forward to the second tower and erected the third, and so on, leapfrogging their way across the valley. The iron columns resembled logs so closely that many people believed it was made of wood. The total project cost $167,000, which is approximately $5.4 million in today's dollars. It was called the Eighth Wonder of the World, and excursion trains brought tourists from Pittsburgh and Buffalo who paid $1 to ride across it and look down. Drinking, gambling, and parties were common on these early excursions. Some bold passengers climbed the ironwork of the viaduct itself, only to find they could not climb back down and had to be rescued from the girders hundreds of feet above the valley floor. But even the Kinzua's iron could not last forever. By 1900, the trains had gotten heavier, and the entire structure had to be rebuilt in steel. A crew of 100 to 150 men, working 10-hour shifts, completed the replacement in 105 days. An astonishing pace complicated by a week-long strike, a presidential campaign visit that drew workers away from the site, and a major forest fire that started beneath the viaduct and burned 2 communities before it was stopped at the edge of a third. The speed limit on the bridge was 5 miles per hour for its entire service life, and veteran railroaders used the crossing to haze new brakemen. When a moving train was within a few minutes of the bridge, old hands would send the rookie over the rooftops of the freight cars on a pretext of checking some mechanical problem. As the train reached the viaduct, the new hire suddenly found himself 300 feet above the valley floor on the swaying roof of a rocking boxcar with no guardrails. Some of them froze and had to be talked down after the crossing. And then in 2003, a tornado with 90-mile-per-hour winds hit the viaduct dead center and knocked down 11 of its 20 towers. The collapse took 30 seconds. The anchor bolts that had held the bridge to its foundations since 1882, the original bolts that were never replaced during the 1900 reconstruction, simply rusted through and let go. Today, the remaining 6 towers at the south end support a pedestrian walkway called the Kinzua Skywalk. There is a glass-bottomed observation platform at the end, and you can stand on it and look straight down 300 feet to the valley floor, where the twisted wreckage of the other towers lies rusting in the forest. A similar story played out at the Pecos River in West Texas, where the Southern Pacific Railroad needed to cross a gorge 321 feet deep. The original route had used a low bridge at the mouth of the Pecos, where it joins the Rio Grande. But reaching that crossing required a winding route called the Loop Line that descended through steep grades, 2 tunnels, and along ledges plagued by rock slides. In 1891, the railroad decided to cross the gorge 5 miles upstream, where the canyon was deeper, but the approach was straighter. They built the Pecos High Bridge in 87 working days, between November 3, 1891, and February 20, 1892. It was 2,180 feet long and 321 feet above the river, making it the highest railroad bridge in North America and the 3rd highest in the world. It was built by the Phoenix Bridge Company out of iron and steel, not wood, and its ironwork alone weighed over 1,800 tons. The first train to cross carried C.P. Huntington, president of the Southern Pacific. The bridge cost $250,000. It stood until 1944, when it was replaced by a newer structure downstream and was finally dismantled in 1949. If you were wondering what happened to all the wooden bridges, the answer is simple. They were burned, rotted, replaced, or torn down. Wood is a temporary material. Every railroad company that built in wood knew it was building something that would need to be replaced within 10 to 20 years. Untreated lumber simply cannot survive 2 decades of rain, snow, sun, wind, and the constant vibration of passing trains. The connections loosen, the fibers compress. Rot sets in at the joints where moisture collects. Insects bore through the heartwood. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, the structure weakens until a maintenance inspection finds a post that crumbles when you drive a spike into it. The transcontinental railroads used wooden trestles as a strategy of speed. Get the line open, get the trains running, start collecting revenue. Then use that revenue to go back and replace the wood with iron or steel or earthen fill. Many canyons that were originally spanned by timber trestles were eventually filled in entirely. Trains of dump cars hauled rock and earth to the site, poured it over the side of the trestle, and gradually buried the wooden structure under millions of tons of fill. The fill was cheaper to maintain than the bridge, and it would last essentially forever. Some of those original trestles are still down there, entombed in the earth, their timbers preserved in the airless dark like fossils. If you were to dig into certain railroad embankments in Wyoming or Montana or Oregon, you would find, beneath the gravel and rock, the squared timbers and iron rods of a bridge that has been buried for over 100 years. If you subscribe to this channel, you already know that these stories are not just about engineering. They are about the people who did the work. And the people who did this work have been almost entirely forgotten. The engineers are in the history books. Octave Chanute has a Wikipedia page. Julius Kruchnitt, who designed the Pecos High Bridge, has a town in Texas named after him. But the men who actually stood on the bents, who drove the piles, who tightened the bolts, who fell and died, they are footnotes at best. Their names appear on construction camp rosters that are crumbling in state archives. Their graves, when they have graves, are in unmarked plots near the rail lines where they worked. What you need to understand is that every photograph you see of a completed timber trestle, that perfect lattice of wood standing against the sky, represents months of suffering that the photograph cannot show. It represents men sleeping in canvas tents in January in Montana, with the temperature at 30 below. It represents the sound of a pile driver pounding from 6 in the morning until 6 at night. It represents the smell of pine sap and sweat and wood smoke, and the metallic tang of blood when someone loses a finger to an adze. It represents the silence that falls over a crew when a man goes off the edge and they hear him hit. These men did calculations in their heads that engineers today do with software. They eyeballed grades that surveyors now measure with lasers. They built structures that stood for decades, using nothing but wood and iron and the geometry they learned on the job from the man ahead of them, who learned it the same way. They had no margin for error. One bent out of plumb, one stringer too short, one foundation on soft ground, and the whole thing could come down with a loaded train on top of it. And it did come down sometimes. The Ashtabula Bridge disaster of 1876 killed 92 people when an iron howe truss collapsed under a passenger train in a blizzard in Ohio. That disaster led to a national reckoning about bridge safety, and eventually to the creation of engineering standards that we still use. But in the years before Ashtabula, and even in the years after, wooden bridges failed with regularity. They caught fire. They washed out in floods. They collapsed under loads they were never designed to carry. Each failure killed people, and each failure drove the industry one step closer to abandoning wood entirely. By the 1920s, the era of the great wooden trestle was essentially over. Steel had won. Concrete had won. The forests that had supplied the timber were logged out in many places. The trains were heavier. The fire risk was unacceptable. The maintenance costs were unsustainable. One by one, the great wooden bridges were replaced or demolished, and the men who built them aged and died without anyone asking them what it had been like. Today, if you want to see what remains, you have to look carefully. In Kinzua Bridge State Park in Pennsylvania, you can walk the skywalk out to the edge of the ruined viaduct and look down through the glass floor at the towers that fell. In the Carrizo Gorge of California, you can hike 6 miles through the desert to the Goat Canyon Trestle and stand beneath it and look up at 185 feet of redwood timber that has been standing in the sun and wind since 1933. In Seminole Canyon State Historical Park in Texas, you can see the old grade of the loop line that the Pecos High Bridge replaced, the abandoned roadbed curving down through the canyons toward the Rio Grande. And in archives across the country, in the Library of Congress, in state historical societies from Pennsylvania to Oregon, the photographs survive. Black and white images of wooden bridges hanging in space, of men standing on half-finished bents with nothing beneath them but air, of locomotives crawling across structures that look far too delicate to hold them. These photographs are all we have. The bridges themselves are gone. The men are gone. The camps are gone. The tools are in museums or rusting in barn corners. Even the forests that supplied the timber are second growth now. The original giants cut down and hauled out a century ago. But here is what I keep coming back to when I study this era. These men solved problems that the modern world would throw billions of dollars and computer modeling at, and they solved them with wood. They looked at a 300-foot canyon and figured out how to stack timber across it so precisely that a 200-ton locomotive could roll over it at 5 miles per hour. They did it in wind, in rain, in snow, in desert heat. They did it with hand tools. They did it for $1.50 a day, and most of them never got a single line in any history book. When you drive across a modern highway bridge, a concrete and steel structure designed by computer and built by cranes and machines, You are standing on the shoulders of men who crossed canyons with wood and rope. Every calculation, every safety standard, every engineering principle that keeps that bridge standing was learned in part from the failures and successes of those wooden trestles. The Howe Truss led to the Pratt Truss, which led to the Warren Truss, which led to the steel bridges that carry freight trains across the continent today. It is a direct line, and at the beginning of that line, there is a man standing on a half-finished bent 200 feet above a canyon floor, driving an iron rod through a timber joint, hoping the wind does not pick up before he gets the bracing in. If you have watched this far, you are the kind of person who cares about the history that nobody else remembers. And if that is true, I would ask you to subscribe, because this channel exists to tell these stories. The stories of the workers and the machines and the impossible structures that built this country before anyone thought to write it down. There is a line in the construction records from the Dale Creek Bridge in Wyoming, written by an engineer whose name has been lost. It reads simply, "Bridge completed. 2 men killed in construction. Names not recorded." That is the epitaph for an entire era. The bridges are gone. The names are gone. But the canyons are still there. And if you stand on the rim and look across, you can sometimes see the old anchor points cut into the rock, the places where the timbers were bolted to the earth. They are the only marks left, and they are enough to tell you that someone was here, and that what they did was extraordinary. The wind blows across the canyon now, and there is nothing in its path.